All right. Well, in that case, I would like to welcome all of you to our next and final Quarantine with Me town hall session on the topic of a very important topic of education during and after the COVID town hall. And it is certainly my big pleasure to welcome all of you, to welcome our panelists to the session who are joining from around the world, and a quick look on who we have on the panel. So we have Candace Banks, a therapist from Phoenix, Arizona, who will be joining, or who's joining us today. We have Jörg Kindermann, also on a panel, teacher from Jena, Germany, who will not be here in person, but he has sent us a message to contribute also to the conversation. Cynthia Muhonja, founder of Life Lifters, based in Kenya, a graduate from Manchester University, one of the Med Foundation's partner universities. Carlos Rilling, senior fellow of the Med Foundation, also and based in Santiago, Chile, working with the University of Chile. And last but not least, Dr. Millicent Ajay, a adjunct lecturer and of course the Director of Diversity and International Programs of HSC University in Ghana. So as you can see, quite a mix and quite a diversity on the panel that brings us together on talking about the education. And education in times of COVID, in times of Corona, is certainly has become a serious issue, and has brought a lot of challenges, and certainly also comes with a lot of opportunities. And we're really looking forward for all of you to join this conversation, to explore the implications of this pandemic and of this crisis on education, and also really leverage our capacity and community of global citizens to learn from each other, to take good lessons, relevant, important lessons forward, to share challenges, to share also failures, because really if we work together and if we connect and bring the spirit of together, we can achieve greater things. That is certainly what we're here for and what we're assembling around. And with just a little further ado before we get started, some housekeeping. As always, housekeeping is very important. Because this is a Zoom meeting and not a webinar, everybody has the power to mute and unmute her or himself in the interest of quality, and so that we're able to actually understand each other. Please stay on mute when not speaking, okay? The other thing is there is a chat function, and we actively encourage you to use this chat function as we're listening into the different presentation and perspective. Raise any comments or bring any comments, observations, raise any question. We'll be monitoring the chat constantly, and as we're following up on the conversations by the panelists or from the panelists in a discussion, question and answer, we'll definitely get to the questions and comments from the chat. So use it ongoing. We will come back to your questions after the presentations. And well, the last thing, whenever you unmute or whenever you talk, try to keep the background noise to a minimum. Most likely it will be primarily the panelists speaking, because we have quite a number of participants on this call. If there may be opportunities when you request a microphone. In that case, raise the hand and then feel free to unmute if we call you out. And then minimizing potential background noise will be much appreciated, so that we can all hear and all appreciate the comments and the conversation. And I guess without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen for now, and will be very happy to introduce our first panelist, Candace Banks, who will be talking about challenges and opportunities for education and the implications of school closure on special education in the USA.
Hey everyone. Good morning. It's morning here, so afternoon and all those things to everyone. I have a few things that I'll talk about. I'll first start by giving you guys just a little background on education in the US. So there are about 50 million students in schools, in public education schools in the US. And then about 7 million of those are special education students. And those are the students that I primarily work with. So students with learning disabilities, students who have intellectual disability, and also students who might be medically fragile, so they haven't had the same opportunities to attend school. So I work with those students. And then in my particular district, there are about 35,000 students affected by the school closures. School closures started around March 16th in the US. We were talking about this a little bit before. The colleges closed a little bit earlier than that, maybe 2 to 3 weeks before that, but because school is a government entity, we had to wait on our government to shut down the schools. So also in the US, as you guys probably know, it's 50 different states with 50 different rules. So each state is a little bit different. But our schools in Arizona closed down around March 16th. And we've been closed throughout the year. Our last day of the school year was last week, Friday. So I have a little bit of time now to myself to think about things. But so schools were closed that entire last quarter. So that's how we break up the school year into 4 parts. And so that fourth part, students weren't in schools. We have about 3.6 million teachers in the US, and that's not including the staff. So like cafeteria workers, maintenance workers, just extra helpers around. So it really affects a lot of people in the US. I also just wanted to mention that the US school system is really governed by 2 main laws. One of them is FAPE, which is free appropriate public education. So every child in the US is entitled to a free and appropriate education, no matter if they have a disability or not. So we have to provide services to all kids. And then the other one is IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Act. And so that means if we're providing services to general education students or students that don't have special needs, we also have to provide services to kids who do have special needs. They can't be left out simply because they have different needs. And like I mentioned, the US is in different stages across each state because it's such a vast country. So in Arizona, the population isn't as big as somewhere maybe like New York State or New York City. So our restrictions weren't as tight, but we did close down schools. So during this period, the last 2 to 3 months or so, we've been working online. So teachers have used Microsoft Office, Facebook, team meetings, lots of different platforms, whichever ones that they could really get to their students on. And so I've seen a lot of creativity and ingenuity in how teachers have tried to reach out to students. Some of the challenges with that, though, is we have students from lots of different backgrounds and lots of different access to technology. So some of our students weren't able to access what the teachers had because either they didn't have enough computers, they didn't have internet access, and we tried different things. So one of our bigger companies who provide Wi-Fi here in the States is Cox. So they provided discounted Wi-Fi services to a lot of families. But once again, that was a lot of bureaucracy. So in order to get the students the things that they needed, we had to go through a lot of different channels and a lot of different paperwork, which means some students didn't get computers or didn't get internet access until maybe 1 or 2 weeks before school closed. So that was one of the challenges. Another challenge is teachers and families just not having training on using these types of programs and doing internet online or doing school online. A lot of parents also were still trying to work from home, or they had multiple children that they were trying to help with schoolwork. So I know in the fall, we'll be meeting students with a bunch of different needs and at a bunch of different levels. So that'll be a challenge going back to school, hopefully, fingers crossed, going back to school in the fall, is just trying to meet our students where they are, given the differences in learning opportunities that they had. Um, Another thing that I kind of wanted to talk about were the challenges of not just the academic parts of school, but schools in the US a lot of the time are the front lines of social services for children and families. So a lot of children get school lunches. Those are some of the only times that they eat during the day is at school. They get counseling services, and also just to have those trusted adults in their lives when sometimes those home situations aren't the best. Since school closures, the US has seen a rise in like domestic abuse and child abuse. So those are some of the things that outside of just learning that have to be thought about, is that school is a lot of the time a safe haven for students. And so how were we going to feed them? How are we gonna make sure that they were still getting the mental health services and those other supports that they need? I will say my district did a good job of providing meals. We had like a drive-through from 10 a.m. to around noon, where families could drive through and pick up a meal from the school. So that was a challenge that we saw and that we met. So I was really proud of my school district on that one. I'll talk just a little bit about implications and some opportunities quickly. So like I was saying, the implications were really just trying to figure out what will school look like when we return after summer break. And will it be everyone's going back to school? The governor of Arizona has made the suggestion that children might go to school in shifts, so there just aren't so many children in the classroom. Right now, a typical classroom could have 25 to 30 students in it. So the governor is thinking about reducing that to maybe 12, and so kids would have to go to school in shifts. So they're still talking about that, but the shifts would either be like every other day. Kids would come to school, or some kids come in the morning, some kids come in the afternoon. But we'll see how that works, because school isn't just about education. Like I said, it's also childcare for many parents. So if children aren't back in school, or if they are on shifts, how are parents going to make work? How are they going to go to work and kind of make that work for their schedules? Another thing that I really saw this year is that many teachers retired. So just kind of with all the different changes that happened, I know just a few teachers at my school, some of the older teachers who were already thinking about leaving. It was just too much to try and learn completely new skills, that they just decided, hey, I'm gonna leave the school system. And then I know also a lot of therapists are considering leaving the school system, just because there's so many more rules and challenges than maybe working in private practice at a time like this. So those are some challenges schools are going to face, is continue to meet those staffing needs, especially when many schools already needed more staff. And then also we're going to really need to think about those laws. Like I said, we do have to provide FAPE and IDEA, and those were challenges to meet those this year. So seeing how those laws are going to change to more accurately fit what's going on right now. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about funding. There is a bit of I want to say like maybe stigma with teachers, that teachers don't work hard in the US, or that like we don't deserve to get paid. And so that's been something that really came up this year at my school, is that instead of like trying to train and learn about how to use these different mediums, they were really heavily focused on documentation. Document everything that you're doing so that we can prove that we were working these last few months. When honestly, we were working harder than I think we ever have, because we needed that learning curve. We had to learn new things and then teach those new things to our students as well, and the parents. So just also managing expectations and what are required of teachers. I will say that there have been lots of really great opportunities for learning. I gotten to work with a lot of great teachers online and doing sessions online. And then just opportunities for our students who may not have been as vocal in class, but they like to use the chat. So they'll talk to us on the chat. We do like less formal check-ins. So a lot of students were a little bit more open to participating in those ways, and just kind of seeing how great teachers are and how we're able to change and adapt to what's going on. And then I'll also say there's also been really great opportunities for parent involvement. So maybe some of those parents who it's like I drop you off in the morning or I put you on the bus in the morning and then I don't worry about school anymore. They've really had to be a lot more active, a lot more involved since their students are at home, and we've been reaching out to parents a lot more. And then I'll also say, I think for the US at large and school districts at large, it really showed everyone that we do need to have multiple systems. And so I think training for teachers on how to teach online is really improved. I know this summer my school district has sent out some videos and some trainings already, and they told us to be prepared because if we're not back in the fall, school will be continuing online. So it's nice that we got to get our feet wet these last few months figuring out how to do it, and now get some more training this summer, and hopefully go back in the fall with a game plan for our students. So that's kind of all I have for you guys today. I'll get to stick around, so I look forward to seeing what the different questions are. And I'll turn it back over to Sonali or Lars.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Candace. Definitely very insightful, and I think also a lot of food for thought and a lot of food for discussion. So just a friendly reminder, we're collecting questions, comments in the chat, so feel free to type along. We'll get to it at the end of once we've heard from all the panelists today. Our next panelist, Jörg Kindermann, he's a teacher at a community school in Jena, Germany. Unfortunately, can't be here, but he sent us a recording with his input. So bear with me as I'm, fiddling around with technology in the meantime. We will get to our next panelist, Jörg, and I think also that his impulse connects very nicely with what Candace was talking about the challenges in school, really, and also what it really means for a teacher practicing moving from a in-person space to an online space. And in Jörg's case, moving back to an in-person space because the schools in Germany are back. So, and that's what we're listening in right now. So over to Jörg in representation.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Jörg. First, I need to apologize for not being here with you today, but it's my mom's birthday and I haven't seen her for 10 weeks or so. So I decided to go there and to pre-record a session. Hope that's okay with you. Talk will have two parts basically. First, I'm going to tell you a bit about the time when the schools closed, how we dealt with that. And in the second part, I'm going to take you on a tour through the school and how it looks like when students are coming back now. I am a teacher at the Gemeinschaftsschule Rilling in Jena, which is in the east of Jena, close to the Jensich, for those of you who've been here before. You can see the new school building on the picture and a map with the location, so it's close to the Saale. We are a pretty new school, founded in 2014, and we only moved into the new building last year. So we are privileged in at least two ways. Everything is new and up to date, including functioning PCs and internet, and we have one of the youngest teaching teams in Thüringen. Our age average is in the low 30s, compared to somewhere beyond 50 in the rest of the state. In Corona terms, that's both good and bad. Good because most of our teachers do not fall into one of the risk groups, which is teachers over 60 and or smokers over 50. Bad because most of our younger teachers have small children at home who cannot go to kindergarten or school because those are closed as well. Our school closed on Monday, March 16th, like all other schools in Thüringen because of Corona. Like everyone else, we only got the information a few days in advance on Friday the 13th. In fact, I was sent home that day because I had mild flu symptoms. So with basically no advance warning, we had to change from regular lessons to homeschool. In the first week, this resulted in quite a variety of different tasks and ways of communication. We used printed worksheets that the students got on their last day in school in some classes. Others were sent emails with tasks, ranging from an hour time frame to 3 weeks deadlines. We also discovered platforms like Padlet or WebEx, which we had never used before, and some of us kept contact with their students via the good old phone. On the slide, you can see a picture of one of the Padlets that I prepared for one of my classes. After a week or so, we started to settle into a homeschooling routine with the focus on not losing any of the students that we could no longer see every day in school. Problems that became more evident now included the difference in access to tech equipment among the students. We have students that shared the only computer in their family with their 3 siblings, as well as students who got all the equipment at home. It also included handing out tasks that could be both worked through by the students independently and still made sense in the current situation and thus motivate the kids. Next point was data security, the questions which platforms we could safely use. And it also included finding ways of communicating not only with the students, but with everyone in the school community, thus keeping up the spirit of being one school. We rather solved that nicely with the school newsletter, the Jensich News, which was born at the end of the first week of the shutdown and then published twice a week on the school's website. You can see one of the issues here on the slide. Homeschooling went on like this for 5 weeks. It was not before the end of April that we got the information that we would be allowed to reopen school, step by step, class by class, and only if a strict hygiene plan was being established and adhered to. We finally started on May 4th with 4 classes of 10th and 9th graders, gradually allowing more students. We hope that by the end of the coming week, every student of our school will have been back for at least a day. Although the school is open again, it's far from being back to regular business, mostly due to health and hygiene regulations. So in the second part and final minutes of my talk, I want to show you how the school looks like these days. That's the sign greeting all students at the main entrance of the school gate. This sign was added to the school door, asking everyone who enters to disinfect their hands. When you've entered the school, you are being stopped by a chair telling you where the disinfection or disinfecting station is. That has been sort of changed last week, I think, for students, for instance, who are allergic to the disinfectant. It's enough if they wash their hands regularly now. One of the main changes to the school is that you are no longer allowed to freely walk wherever you want to. There's strict traffic control, if you want to call it that. You always have to go on the right side, and there are 3 sections in the school, the blue, the red, and green one, and students are only allowed to move in one of these sections, so I'm in the blue section most of the time. This also means that there are areas which are out of bounds for students and most of the staff, marked by the red and blue tape on the ground. For instance, the office, which is in online mode only for the time being. As the school was closed in March, most of the projects that we had at that time also stopped abruptly. One of them is the bee house that we are building. So the parts are lying around in the main hall at the moment, waiting for the project to continue. This picture was taken 2 weeks ago. It's no longer up to date. We started handing out food last week again, but it's nothing like it was before. There's only one student at a time at the table allowed, and they have to be cleaned roughly after the students left. They are no longer allowed to take the food themselves. It's been handed out. So it's not the communal thing that we as a school want the meal times to be. It's more eating, just eating. Here you can see one of the probably more serious limitations at the moment, for reasons of being able to trace any possible infections and people who had contact with each other, or people teaching and learning in the blue section have to use or can use only one toilet. There are 2 seats in there. That means that about 90 people in one day have only 2 toilets to use. The hygiene plan includes that every room that has been used must be disinfected at the end of the day, because next day the next group's coming in. So here you can see the sign telling the cleaning staff to please disinfect that room. This is what a classroom looks like today. We had to limit the seats from usually 25 to about 12 for one room, to allow for enough space in between the tables. Also, everyone has to wear a face mask as soon as someone in the class is moving. Fortunately enough, we can put them down when everyone is seated and we have the usual lesson. But no group work, no pair work or whatever are allowed. It's basically lectures and doing worksheets. Okay, that was the quick tour of my school and of the history of how we dealt with Corona. I hope you have a good session, and apologies again for not being here and for the probably bad sound quality. Bye.
So yes, so that was Jörg Kindermann's input about what it looks like nowadays in schools, particularly in Germany, since going back to a routine, but a quite different routine. I think that has become quite clear. And with that said, I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, our next panelist, Cynthia Muhonja, who's a woman rights activist and founder of Life Lifters in Kenya, who will be talking about the effects of COVID-19 on girls' education in rural communities in Africa and how countries can effectively address them. So I'll be sharing the slides for Cynthia, and Cynthia will be prompting me whenever the next slide is due. And with no further ado from my side, I'll be muting myself and hand over to Cynthia. So over to you, Cynthia.
Oh, hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia, as Ras said, and I'm so glad to be part of this conversation. And essentially, I just wanted to highlight some of the key things or key aspects that COVID-19 is affecting. And there's not a lot of like social media, there's not a lot of people speaking about these issues. about, they're speaking about the economy, they're speaking about how COVID-19 is affecting the health sector, but no one is talking about how it's affecting women and girls in different parts of the countries and essentially even globally. I mean, to essentially move this discussion further, Lars, next slide. I thought it'd be interesting to sort of like just look generally how COVID-19 is affecting women on a general overview before I even dive deeper into discussing about how it will affect girls and women in different communities or rural communities in Africa. So I know you guys have learned about the economy, and I mean, everyone, the media is basically talking about how this pandemic is going to affect the economy. But I would like to narrow down into how it's going to essentially affect the economic welfare of women. So what we know is, so approximately globally, and I would say globally, about 740 million women work in the informal sector. In the informal sector, by working in the informal sector, it means that they earn less, they save less, that they also hold less stable jobs. So when companies are downsizing at the moment, a lot of women are going to be out of their jobs, right? One other aspect that comes with COVID-19 is the aspect of restricted movement. And I don't know if your countries are reporting issues of domestic violence and all that, but restricted movement is equals to increased cases of gender-based violence for women. So countries are now reporting skyrocketing rates for gender-based violence cases. Just today, I read an article. There's a father who is planning to marry his 14-year-old daughter as his third wife. And these are issues that are actually taking place and no one is talking about. So I sort of like did a little bit of research, and we the UN Women sort of like printed a lot of information around this. And France, just since like March 17th, when France sort of like initiated their lockdown, they reported a 30% increase in cases of domestic violence. Argentina is at 25% increase. When you look at Cyprus and Singapore, we are at 30 and 33% respectively. So these cases are essentially rising. Last, I think you should go to the next slide. So for this slide generally just gives you a lot of sort of like a look into some of the issues that are affecting women right now. We know that women spend a lot of time in unpaid care work, domestic care work, and it doesn't mean when you do a lockdown, it doesn't mean that this actually will reduce. It means that it actually goes further. So women are taking care of the sick, they're taking care of children, they're taking care of every single, they're making sure everyone is eating in the home. I mean, there's a lot of work that they're working on. So combine that plus, if they have a job or all that, it means that they're actually overwhelmed. And out of like 100, and this was quite interesting, out of like 100 male figures in the community or in different parts of the world, out of 100 of them, 125 women out of this 100 male, are actually expected or will be living under extreme poverty. It means that they have less access, so close to zero access to resources and all that. So that's one of the things. Well, I think we should move to the next slide. I think, yeah, generally, yeah. So I sort of like had to do a little bit of research in terms of like how this will affect girls, and UNESCO did a research, sort of like a research into education and how, how many students are out of school and all that. I don't know, my internet is unstable. Can you guys hear me? Yes, great. Okay, so UNESCO did a research, and they sort of like generally like a general outlook of how COVID-19 is affecting different students, and they estimated that about 89% of students are out of school, and this number estimates to about 1.54 billion children and youth. Out of this number, 730 million are girls. And the sad fact of it, I would say the problem aspect of it is that 101 million girls actually live in underdeveloped countries. So I'm talking about countries like, think of Africa, think of Asia, think of Guatemala, places where girls are already facing a lot of issues when it comes to access to education. So there's 111 million girls at risk right now as we speak, because they might not have access to online education. They might not have access to some of the resources that we see around that schools are actually giving out, right? I already spoke about the fact that staying at home doesn't mean easy or more free time for girls. Girls are actually expected to take care of the home. They're essentially helping their mothers to cook the meals. They're essentially helping their mothers to take care of, family needs, clean, chores, and all that. So staying at home actually means more work for girls. So they have less time to study, less time to focus on other things apart from taking care of the family, right? And I think I've already addressed the fact that gender-based violence is increasing. I mean, there's a lot of reported cases of girls being, molested at this time, because most of them now are forced to stay at home with people who are, abusing them or are potentially going to abuse them. So they are essentially forced to stay at home with them. And an interesting part of it is the fact that COVID-19, yes, there's lockdowns and everything is locking down, and systems, healthcares, and all these places are locked down. But this thing doesn't mean that some of the issues that girl faces, menstruation is still a problem. Like, COVID-19 won't stop a girl from menstruating, or it won't stop a girl from needing the pads. It won't stop a girl from needing some of the key things that we need. Generally, as women, the things that we need to essentially take care of ourselves, COVID-19 doesn't really mean that those things stop, right? We still need them. So that's another issue. Next slide, sir. So I sort of had to discuss, the impact of this is going to have generally on their education. So we sort of I've looked at different aspects, the economy, the general welfare of a girl. But when it comes to education, you all understand that now funds are being diverted. There's a lot of, diversion of funds into healthcare, into different sectors. Families are diverting their funds into, it's not about education anymore. It's like, okay, how do we use the limited resources that we have to essentially take care of ourselves, buy food for ourselves, they're essentially diverting those funds. And with the diversion of funds, it means that most of these girls won't have access to the internet. So remember, 111 million girls already have a problem accessing online education. So, and then the limited funds that they have, they're being diverted. So it means that really at the end of the day, most girls in this period, I would say even in Africa, most girls don't have access to education. They won't have access to education. We are not against online education. We are not against it. We are not, I love the fact that schools are, transitioning into online classes and all that. But most girls, if you look, most girls in Africa, I would say even most girls in Kenya or other, they live in already, their families don't have internet. They don't have access to internet. The resources like books, they're already limited. So most girls don't have access to online education. That's why in that picture, yes, you can see a girl and she's like, I'm not against online education or in online teaching, but what about us? right? The small girl, she's never seen a laptop before. She's never seen a smartphone before. She's never, I mean, her family, if they're really lucky, they own a radio, right? And this radio, at the end of the day, I mean, there's a lot of things going on. The family wants to listen. The radio maybe belongs to a man, and he's the one dictating which channels to listen to. So essentially, this girl is gonna get close to zero education during this period. Yes, I already spoke about the fact that learning resources are limited, and girls, there's a lot of girls, most of the girls are, and most of their time is actually invested in unpaid care work in terms of like taking care of, working on chores and all that, and taking care of their home, taking care of their little brothers and sisters and all that. So most girls are not going to study during this COVID-19. Next slide, sir. I mean, that leaves a lot of questions for us, and I think I'll say there's a lot of things that we need to do. But essentially for this, I talked about the fact that we needed, I mean, the fact that how countries, different countries, or even individuals like us can essentially help more girls easily transition or easily catch up on their schools. For countries, I would say they need to involve a lot of women during this period into their, like, you know, into their plans, essentially. So they need to involve a lot of women around in conversations involving COVID-19, so that at the end of the day, the women and girls have a voice when it comes to measures for addressing COVID-19. A lot of efforts needs to be targeted in addressing the social economic impact of this COVID-19 on women and girls. So, I mean, yes, they're talking about the economy. A lot of countries are talking about how they're going to come back. But in order for them to come back, it means that they have to invest in certain aspects. So yes, I've talked about 740 million women working in the informal sectors. What are countries doing about it? What are different organizations doing about this figure, right? Are they considering the fact that women work in informal sector and they need access to these resources? So, because if you open up, let's say, a fund and say, oh, we're going to invest in women, we're going to invest in businesses and help them come up after this COVID-19, if you're not particular about the gender lens, then it means that a lot of women are going to be poor. A lot of women are going to be pushed into poverty after this COVID-19. Post-pandemic girl-centered programs to ensure girls report back to school. This is very important because the truth is most girls right now are going to be involved in transactional sex. Transactional sex means that they're going to essentially give out their body so that they can get sanitary towels, or they can get their needs catered for, or they're forced into it. Also, because for some families in Kenya, and I've seen this essentially in my community, and these are some of the things that I'm trying to work on, is the fact that when a family can't take care of their needs, they essentially look at the girl and they're like, okay, we can use you, you can go and sleep around with the motorcycle rider, and they'll give you 100 Kenya shillings or 200 Kenya shillings, and then you bring that back home and we buy food. So essentially, a lot of girls are going to be exposed to these things. And what we need are programs that essentially will target girls after this COVID-19 and help them transition from COVID-19 back to school, because most girls are going to be locked out during this period. First, they haven't been studying. Second, they don't have access to resources and all that. Third, it will be hard for them to catch up. Fourth is they've been exposed to a lot of issues in terms of some of them will be pregnant, some of them will have children. How do we figure out that? So a lot of programs need to be targeted around this area to essentially help more girls transition into back to school. And this, I'm not talking about primary school, I'm not talking about high schools only, I'm even talking about universities. Because a lot of girls right now, the truth is, most women are out, and a lot of schools need to be particular about, looking at how many students went out, how many students actually came back, right? How many women are coming back to school after this COVID-19. I mean, this is the suggestion that I had, sort of like create a girls' education stroke protection fund, where this is a fund that is actually will help more girls go back to school. We already know that most parents will be most people will be out of their job. It's either companies will cut down their salary. I mean, there's a lot of issues that come with COVID-19. So it means that limited resources will be put into girls' education. So we need to essentially invest a lot of resources into girls' education. So you set up a fund, say, okay, we'll give scholarships to women, scholarships to girls to help them go into school. And then the last recommendation I had is social protection laws, essentially, that help girls, they should be moved online in terms of like, if a girl is being, I don't know, there's a lot of statistics that are saying that every 2 seconds a girl is being married off. Every 7 seconds a girl is being molested or something like that. What are countries doing about it? How are we reporting these cases? Do we have systems that can help girls right now in this period essentially report these cases, or say that, I'm in danger, how can I, get out? How do you have centers where girls can run into? Because most of them are locked at home, and really they won't have access to resources that will help protect them. So essentially move some of these services online. They will help protect girls a lot. Yes. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much for having me. I hope you learned something. Feel free to ask questions, and yeah, thank you.
Well, and thank you very much, Cynthia, to you. This has certainly been a very interesting perspective and insightful perspective also on particularly girls' education in rural communities. I think quite different from what we've talked about before, and at the same time very connected, and also connecting quite nicely with our next panelist, Carlos Rilling, who is the Deputy Director of Undergraduate Affairs at the Universidad de Chile, the University of Chile, who will be talking about equity concerns in higher education and how is the experience of students going to change post-COVID. So also kind of considering the equity and access, I think is something that we'll talk about going forward. And with no further ado, handing over to Carlos.
Thank you very much. Everyone hears me well? Thank you very much, and thank you for this space for discussing about these issues that are concerning, especially the ones of us that work in subjects related to equity. I want to talk about the experience of our students in what we're facing in COVID and what we think is going to change after COVID-19. And first, I wanted to let you know where I'm speaking from. I work in Universidad de Chile. This is a highly selective, research-oriented institution. We serve around 33,000 undergraduate students. We have around 4,300 academics. And why I wanted to talk about this highly selective, research-oriented institution? Because in this context that tends to be not very equitative, we also have the burden of having a centralized, standardized access system in the country that's based in a synchronic test that covers the main knowledge subjects. And the selection of the student is based on quantitative scores. And there has been lots of research about what happens when you put quantitative scores only in selection for the universities. So we are having a nationwide coverage with the system, but we have troubling results in terms of equity and inclusion. I'm going to show you a slide about how this looks. But basically, the students that come from more privileged backgrounds tend to have better scores and get selected in better universities. That's why since 2010, we're implementing an equity access program. We call it CIPE. That's the acronym in Spanish. And it's oriented to bring first-generation students and those coming from unprivileged backgrounds and public schools to the university to build a more diverse cohort of students. Currently, we serve around 52% of our new students come from a first-generation family. And this is important. Why? Because when you look at the scores, and this is without COVID, I'm showing you in the slides in the left side of the screen is the results of the 90 percentile of the students. And it's divided between private schools, privately owned but government subsidized schools, and public schools. And you're going to see that private schools have, in 2020, 33% of the students that are in the 90th percentile, the ones that get most chances to get selected. Those students, this 43% of the 90 percentile is actually 10% of the global population. So this group is overrepresented in the high scores. And if you take it to a percentile 99, it's 59%, but actually they are just the 10% of the students in the country. So this just to highlight how very inequitable the system is. And this is the context we're working on. I'm going to get back to this later. So in this context, I just want to highlight, and it's very related with the previous presentations, and I'm going to leave the link here because the one that's in the presentation doesn't work, that we're not delivering online education. And this has been widely discussed by many others because we're doing what they call emergency remote teaching, because online education is something you prepare for, you learn about it, you have there's a whole subject, there's a discipline about online education. And emergency remote teaching says, okay, on March 10 we were teaching face-to-face, and in March 15 we started to give online classes, and we're starting to deliver the contents over something we didn't knew what's happening, and it was really new for everyone. So it's very important to understand that we're not giving online education, because online education has planning, it has, you have a learning curve that is longer. And in the article I gave you in the chat, you're going to see these differences and these approaches from different academics. And I think this takes a little bit of the burden about being like giving online education like perfectly, because all of us, the ones that teach, all of us are also facing the challenges of COVID-19. It's not a normal process, so we shouldn't expect the results of a normal online planning. So I'm going to show you in the next, so what happened here, sorry. I'm going to show you why this should be a topic of concern. Why talk about equity and higher education? First, because the universities, and this happens worldwide, and college campuses equalize social inequities for the students. They provide a baseline of tools, of resources, of connections. They give you the same space for everyone. It's an equalizer. So the university tends to make like, it's more a fair square for everyone. So when you lose this, you reinstate the underlying social inequalities that you have, and you eliminate, in some sort, this safety net that the students have in campus. You rely on their resources. It's just, as the previous speaker said, I mean, you have to use what they have at home. You have to work with what they have in their real life. And that's very complicated when you don't realize that you have a diverse student body that have different connections. In a highly unequal society, as Chile, the socioeconomical status of your family and your social capital are strong predictors of your future opportunities. I mean, here, it's really hard to break that barrier that you previously have. So in this highly unequal context, if you have a student that in the university has internet, has books, has protected time, has childcare, and you take everything out and you bring them back to their own reality, it's really, really hard. And therefore, the effects of the pandemic are affecting not only the experience of the ones that are currently enrolled in school, but the experience of the students that are in high school. And that's one of the things that we're worrying about, because how private and public schools are handling this is very different. And we're assuming this is going to affect the next cohorts of students that are coming. So very, very shortly, what's happening right now at high schools? In private schools, they all started with online classes in March. Almost every student in a private school has a personal computer. They have a quiet space to study. That this is really important. We have learned that this is really, really important. If you don't have a quiet place to study or to take tests or to learn, it's really hard to get involved in it. And they don't have additional responsibilities. Most of them have the privilege of having their time for their own. But in public schools, we have seen that we have very different experience. Many of their students don't have a personal computer. I just spoke yesterday with a friend that works in a public school, and she said that 60% of the students only have a smartphone, and most of them don't have a computer, or they share one in the house with other members of the household that also have had to work from the home or stuff like that. And they're struggling with the economic difficulties related with the pandemic. But the most troubled thing we're seeing is that classes in public schools started only in May. They lost 2 months. In private schools, they were like up like this because they had the resources, they have the tools and everything. But in public schools, they lost time because they had to make a whole system that they didn't have. So what's going to happen? Our students that are in the last year, that next year are going to go into university, they already have another burden from the inequality we have seen in the structure previously. And what's happening at universities? Most institutions in Chile have developed plans to engage in online emergency remote teaching. The first months we dedicated to provide connectivity for students. We sent SIM cards all around Chile for students and to help their academics to transform their teaching to remote settings, because as we said before, they didn't know about this. Most of our, I don't know if most, but a very important proportion for academics had to learn how to use the virtual environments and stuff like that. So we have been helping our academics to transform their teaching to a remote setting, not giving them the burden to make it like an online perfect class, but to deliver the contents in a very decent way. Currently, what are the challenges we're facing? We have to rely on what students and teachers have in their houses, and that's very complicated. We have sent computers, we have sent SIM cards, but if you have a very packed house, if you have 8 people living in a 40 square meter house, it's really hard to make these people to concentrate in taking a very hard calculus exam. It's really complicated. So this equalizer, the university as an equalizer, is not as strong as it was when we have our physical facilities. And this is the hard part for equity. The anxiety of the future, that's the other part, and the current inability we're having to project scenarios because the situation is very dynamic. Yesterday, I learned that Cambridge University, they have 4 different scenarios that they're rolling out. So they're making 4 different plans for 4 different rollouts of the pandemic. It's affecting everyone on different levels. So these are the 3 questions we're working on this month. Will someone in my family be affected with COVID? That's a very important part, because currently in Chile also we're having a very difficult situation. The curve was like flat, and then it rised, and we're having like a very strong rise at the moment. Will my socioeconomic status change? Where we're having now students that are having to decide between staying in the university or to work to provide for the families. And this is very hard when you have a cohort of 52% of first generation students. They have to decide if they're going to have to work. The other part that we're working around is how to promote fair assessment and academic integrity without invading our students. I don't know if you have learned about what the universities are doing with these proctoring systems that have to record the student that interrupt the exams if someone goes behind the screen. And this is a very hard thing, because the academic bodies and faculties tend to be very protective of the integrity of the exam in the class. So how to do it in the house when you can be sending WhatsApp questions and WhatsApp answers to everyone? And this is a question that we're having right now. And the other thing is that in Chile, scholarships for higher education have a limited time span. So if you go into a 5-year program, you have to do it in 5 years, and otherwise you have to pay for the years, for the extra years you have to make. So many students now are struggling with the anxiety about, I'm going to be able to finish my courses in the terms of my scholarship, or I'm going to have to pay afterwards, and how to deal with that in a very stressing environment. So just to end, I want to leave 4 questions for discussion. Can we prevent, as a system, as global citizens, to this crisis, to make our higher education system more unequal, more eliticized? I mean, to re-eliticizing the higher education system that we're fearing. What are the new scenarios that our graduates are going to face after COVID-19? Because clearly, this is going to change the way our students are going to face the labor market after COVID-19. How can we support our teaching staff and our students to keep their relationships? One of the most troubling things we have had this year is that the first year students were enrolled on the first week of March, and they didn't have the chance to meet their teachers face to face, and they had to start online. I mean, they didn't have the chance to share coffee with their partners, and they haven't had a properly university experience. So this is probably going to affect the way they work together in a system that promotes working based in teams. And that's the 4th part. How can we promote this bonding with a first year cohort that didn't have a chance to meet face to face? And that's something we're working on right now, trying to promote not only academic activity, but also social activity, and trying to engage them to connect to each other. And that's, I have a last one. This is from it's a tweet I took from online from a student that received the chip, the SIM card, and she was very happy. This is at the beginning of April. And almost 5,000 of our students have received those letters with SIM cards on it. And it's part of what the universities have to think about now. It's part of what the universities have to develop now to change their student welfare system to this kind of modalities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for contributing with this very, very relevant and very important point. And I guess it's a continuity. We may have moved from, from schools to community education to university, but there's certain tendencies that carry through. So talking about the equalizing possibilities that universities bring is certainly much appreciated. And I guess this is a very smooth transition also to introduce our final and last panelist, Dr. Millicent J., Director of Diversity and International Programs at Ashesi, and of course also adjunct lecturer at Ashesi University in Ghana, who will be talking about projected implications of COVID-19 on the educational system in Africa and the opportunities, barriers impacting responses of participants that come with it. So with no further ado, Millicent, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lars, and I will be happy if you can give me access to share my screen. There we go. Hi everyone, and wow, what a rich pool of panelists you've put together, right? I mean, many of the things I'm going to talk about, trust me, despite the fact that I'm going to zoom in on big picture, what is happening on the continent, many of the things that you've spoken about applies, right? And so I would just have a broad impact so far. I'll look at some of the challenges and how various, participants have responded, how governments have responded, how educational systems have responded, how families have responded. And then collectively, I'm hoping we can explore some of the opportunities also that, whilst it's a problem, whilst it's bringing about all these social inequalities, the many opportunities is also, presenting for us for action, right? And in my own, thinking, how we can begin to reimagine this whole concept of quality education that the SDG presents. What does quality even mean, right? We've done a good job, to me, in access, in pushing more people to gain access. But what is the meaning of access when the quality of what they get, it's really close to useless, right? I did a work with a friend in Niger, and a parent, we were looking at the impact of, poor quality education, and the parents lamented that I've sent my child, to school to spend 12 good years of her life in the school system. She finishes, cannot read, cannot write, does not have any skill set in terms of the academy to transition her to gain that social mobility. And therefore, as parent, I feel I have done a great disservice by sending this child to school, because at least if she were to be at home with me, I can teach her all these social, skills, all these traditional skills that potentially can give her access to move into gaining some form of social mobility, right? And so the concept or the conversation about quality just cannot be overemphasized. And I feel that this pandemic has offered all of us an opportunity to see what is wrong and potentially how the various ways that we can take action to respond to that. Okay, so I'll look broadly at government, I'll look at our educational institution, and I'll look at the specific implication for families, students and their families. So Africa, like any other, continent, for now, out of the 54 countries that we have, 52 are infected by my last count, right? And the approaches or responses has not been any different from all these major countries. I think that we have been fortunate that as to what was projected, the number of deaths and the number of infection hasn't been as astronomical as other, countries we are seeing globally. And I can just say that we have been fortunate, because if that has happened, given the fact that we do not have the best of medical systems, we do not have the best of, economic system to support such a pandemic. Countries that have solid economic system are trembling. And so if you imagine if this has taken that toll on the continent, how catastrophic that would be. And so I'll say that we have been fortunate, but also not neglecting that, taking action. So let me zoom right into what is happening on the continent. For now, I think the most affected countries are Egypt and South Africa, right? They have also, for South Africa, I'm happy to say that they've also been one of the countries on the continent that has tested the most. And so whilst the rate of infection, as we are all seeing, that you will know it when you test it, right? If you don't test, you wouldn't know who is infected, So countries like South Africa and even Ghana has done a great job with the testing and being very proactive in taking very decisive decisions. And I believe that that is what is contributing to some of the low rates that we are registering compared to what is happening on the globe. And so for many governments, they are at the point where they are at the crossroad between, health versus all other things, education being included, right? Do I ensure that I am protecting, or I am enhancing my medical system and medical facilities so that people do not get infected? Education is just relegated to the background. And so that is really, in the grand scheme of things, not at the forefront when it comes to things that many governments on the continent are battling with. That, moving on, it has made most governments on the continent have put the education, when the pandemic happened, on pause, where, hold on whilst I take care of the medical system, right? And so looking at a continent where many of our education system are not naturally online. And I love, Carlos, your quote about we not doing online or online education, but doing emergency education, right? That's exactly what we are doing. And unfortunately, the system that we need to do that education system, you know, it's not what many African countries have, okay? And so battling between health and education until we figure education out, putting education on pause, and then now moving into the conversation of now that we seem to have, you know, our health system somehow sorted, somehow figured out education. Right, and so most governments, including the government of Ghana, are looking at alternative sources of education. So, you know, exploring things now like, I'm tempted to now move away from online education to emergency education, where they are looking at things like using the radio system, using, you know, what kind of infrastructure is in place that is accessible. Because whilst I won't spend so much time on the issue of, you know, equity, majority of our educational system is heavily supported by government. So they run on the public education system. And I mean, in most African countries, the public education system hasn't seen the best of funding. And so resource, you know, is really poor. However, there's a high chance that there will be a radio in the house. And I love what Cynthia points out, that even that radio, there's competition for it, right? And so most likely it's going to be by that male who bought that radio, and he is going to be the one to determine whether you're going to listen to the news or that talk show, you know, that comes off every day that there's actually that educational broadcasting taking place. So even all these alternative forms are not viable, okay? So this is broadly what is many African countries or governments are battling with, you know. And then moving on to our educational system, there's a mirage of things that they are also challenged with, and that is informing their responses. The first just being infrastructure, right? Our infrastructure is not set for online education, one. And so even the school system do not have adequate infrastructure. Some higher education system might have, but when you come to the secondary and the primary level, there are schools with absolutely no computers, where even that one computer is sitting in the headmistress or head teacher's, you know, office, who has ownership, and anyone who wants to use it must book to have access. So, you know, in the grand scheme of infrastructure, become education system is really lacking. And then if we say that we're going to do e-learning through, you know, many of the avenues, either Google, you know, Classroom, or those are the popular ones, Google Classroom, people are using Zoom a lot, you know. E-learning, it's not the norm, right? It's not the norm for many institutions. And so what it takes to do e-learning, it's even absent. So I remember very well our government, when the government put a pause on education, they made this big public statement to say that we are going to move all our classes online across board. And then the head of the national, Ghana National Education of Teachers came out and said that nothing happened because we are not equipped, right? And I guess that moves to the next point on capacity. We are not even as teachers equipped. We don't know how to do it. We are not technologically, you know, capable of delivering that e-learning. Forget about infrastructure. Even when you have the we don't know how to do it, right? And this is the head of the Ghana National Association of Teachers. And that is not unique to Ghana. right? Across board. Maybe at the university level, to some extent, some teachers who have that capability, but many of our school systems here, just because we are not set up like that, do not have the capacity, okay? And I'm talking about a system where a lot is dependent on the teacher, right? We are talking about a system where the teacher is the center of the education of many children. What the teacher says is what is. We still have a lot of the banking system across many African countries. And the question is, when the person who is responsible for delivering that education is not capable, what happens to the students themselves, right? Students are not naturally set to own their own learning. It's not student-centered. So when the teacher who is supposed to deliver it, when there's no infrastructure for the school system, what happens is bigger, right? That even when you give all the tools that they need, there's a bigger problem of training of the person who is going to do the delivery. And so this is what the new normal looks like in our educational system now, where many families, best as they can, if you are lucky to come from a family where your parents have had some level of education, you get them helping you out with a lot of homeschooling, teaching you from, you know, either your notes or whatever your teacher sent through WhatsApp, they help you. We have another set of group who are coming more from the private school system, who have access to computers, access to, you know, internet. Remember at Ashesi, when we locked down, we gave all our students one right to be able to access internet. However, whilst you give them the bandwidth, they go to their villages and the system to put that bandwidth, it's not even there. But this is what it's looking like. And there's a third group of people more forming within the class that Cynthia talked about, where, I mean, parents are not educated. They know nothing like, you know, coming from an environment where people can even support in the absence, do the best they can, right? And so when it comes to families, this whole pandemic has interrupted greatly the education of many, you know, and I'm glad that Cynthia zoomed in on girls, but it's general for all, especially for kids who fall under the low socioeconomic ladder, right? Now, I mean, I love the fact that Candace talked about in the US, the education system just does not provide education, but it forms as a front line for delivering many social interventions. It's similar in many African countries. We run a whole school feeding system, you know, in some of our secondary schools. And when this is taken away, there are many kids now who are going hungry, who are not having access to some of these social interventions, which we would normally use the school system to deliver. And that is causing a whole lot of challenges, you know, for kids now. So although it's an interruption in the education, there's different layers of other things that have been interrupted. Now, families normal have been interrupted. There are parents who have lost their jobs. You know, there are families who are having to navigate between, you know, what is needed and what is education now has become what is desirable and not what is needed anymore, right? I had a student who, you know, after going home, the breadwinner of the family got locked up in another town. And so he had to take on full responsibility of the house. Within that time, a sister who was living with them had a baby. And in the middle of class, you know, sent me this SOS message, literally in tears, and said, I can't handle it anymore. I'm in the middle of the market trying to find food to feed the family. I have a capstone project that is due and I just can't take it anymore. And so I had to quickly move in to intervene, okay? When it comes to, you know, the e-learning or this emergency learning that we are doing, much as we have the best of intentions, in our case at Ashesi, for instance, we gave all our students bandwidth. We gave them, access to internet connections so they have to buy regardless of their background. But guess what? They go back and they do not have, and this is not just outside Ghana, even here in Ghana, you move to a different part and the infrastructure to even access, it's not, available. And so at the beginning stage of this pandemic, there was a lot of resistance, because of this disparity, where students, there was a lot of resistance to move online or to have any, alternative source. And what students advocated was to make this equal for all of us, just put a hold on it, right? Don't give us any bandwidth to make it equal. Put a pause on it until the playing field is leveled, right? And so there were many uprisings, there were many demonstrations and all of that. And at this point, many families are beginning to navigate, because guess what? Whilst government has put a pause, their colleagues are learning. Their colleagues who are fortunate to have access are learning. So in Ghana, the rhetoric, for instance, is that when we go back, we will start from scratch. So no child is behind. We all know that when you've had access, when you've been exposed and you sit in the same classroom with someone who doesn't have access, it is never way around it in the best way they know how, okay? Now, all this hasn't been gloomy. There's been some emerging opportunities. I want to spend a couple of minutes to talk about these opportunities that we are seeing across the continent. There's been a lot of collaboration happening between the private sector, between the government, especially in the area of telecommunication. Many universities or many governments now are moving into agreements where these mobile companies are zero-rating educational sites. And so once your university or once your institution is able to move their system onto, any of these communications network, they zero-rate it so that they remove that element of cost, right? And I think this is where we all come in as global citizens, that we should look at this from the lens of collaboration. Okay, there isn't going to be a problem resolved on an individual country basis. And I'm happy to say that we are beginning to see some of these collaborations across the continent as we are facing them. It's also giving the opportunity for a lot of innovation. Okay, so I know in many universities, they are doing a lot of research now, trying to find their own contextually relevant, responses and solutions to this pandemic. In Ghana, we've seen a lot of innovation, especially the intervention put in place to prevent, the spread of the disease. So, a young man came up with a solar hand washing machine, which was approved by the standard boards, and it's in use now. So, this is a hand washing machine that you don't have to touch it, right? So we are beginning to see a lot of innovation in terms of research especially, but also in terms of how we can work together to go about the problem that we are seeing. In the educational system, for instance, Ashesi, as an example, is not built on an online platform. However, all faculty had to move quickly to, readjust their curriculum to make it online friendly. And it's pushing, people to think beyond their normal to innovate. For me, I have been really, really pleasantly surprised by the resilience of our students who, without, this support, they themselves have managed to figure things out. And that's how I put it, figuring things out in the sense that they are now beginning to move online. They are now beginning to own their own education in the absence of the teacher. You give an assignment, and unlike before where they could walk to their roommates, room and all of that, they are collaborating through Skype, and WhatsApp and various means to make that education possible. So when it's in the absence of making it possible for them, they are figuring it out and finding ways around it. So it's really exciting. And then I feel that this pandemic is highlighting, as I mentioned, the various inequalities that we have in our system. And it's a great opportunity for us to actually do something about it, because when you don't know your problem, you can't fix it, right? Whilst we knew that there were a lot of inequalities in our broad educational system, this pandemic has highlighted specifically ways that people are left behind when we don't think, or we are not inclusive in our policy designs and the way that we deliver education to the various populations that we serve. It also gives us an opportunity to reassess our current educational system on the continent, because like I mentioned, a lot is dependent on the teacher. We are coming from an environment where in the absence of the teacher, the student is disabled. The student does their own learning.
And that is most unfortunate. It seems Millicent dropped. Talking about remote or emergency remote teaching and online learning, I think that is a very clear example. And also what, as Millicent was talking about, the importance of the teacher, were kind of left hanging mid-air because we wanted to hear through the talk. But we'll see if Millicent can connect back. Nonetheless, moving also in the interest of time, and I know there are lots and lots and lots of questions in the chat and comments in the chat, and Sonali has been monitoring this diligently. In the interest of time, we will pick 5 of these questions. Some of the questions, and I appreciate also the panelists for having on, and all of you also who have already had conversations around and tackled questions in the chat. That's the spirit, and that's also totally aligned of figuring things out, as Millicent just called it, and working with in the absence of the teacher, so to say. Sorry for building all these bridges, as remote emergency teaching. Here we are, and moving back to the main thought. Sorry about that. Moving slowly but surely into the question and answer and transitioning. And for that, first of all, I would like to thank all the panelists present, currently still present throughout the call, and also absent through the call, thinking of your Kinderman who joined, who shared his recording, for providing the food for thought, and also sharing the experience on the ground, what education looks like in different scenarios and different contexts, and certainly a rich conversation to be had. And with no further ado, I will be handing over to my dear colleague Sonali for some of the questions. Unfortunately, we won't have time for all, but for some of the questions that we should tackle in this context.
Thank you, Lars. I will put together some of the questions so that, because they were focusing on similar topics, and anybody on our panel or even in our audience can feel free to answer them if they would like to. So one of the first questions that we have is, given the current unpredictability of COVID-19 and the lockdowns, is there any kind of timeline or a plan for the coming academic years in your respective universities, or will it be even possible to start the next year as planned in terms of content, or at the different levels that the students might be in? Like some might have actually had full access to internet and have kept up with the syllabus, while the others might not have. Yep, Carlos, I can see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I said in the chat, I don't know if Millicent wants to finish or wrap up
Yes, please. I'll be grateful if I
Yeah, I think
finish.
that's
And this is
exciting.
exactly what I'm talking about. And this is exactly what we've seen throughout. Do you still see my screen?
Yes, you're back on,
Yes.
Millicent, and we hand back over to you. We already moved over to the question and answer, but please, please, please finish your thought. We were hanging in there. So over to you
Do you
again, and
see
then we
my
go.
screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm just going to move to the very last slide that I have on in respect with all of this for a continent like Africa, which the global population census predicts a doubling of our population by 2050. Quality is something that is paramount, right, when it comes to education, because this doubling of our population come 2050 can present a lot of opportunities or also a lot of disaster when you have a huge percentage of your population who are under the age of 25 who are unemployed because they do not have the skill set that is setting them up to engage with socio-economic mobility. Then it's a problem. So for a continent like ours, it is very essential that we do not take, for granted this opportunity that we are seeing with all what is lacking in our educational system, but take it as an opportunity to take action, right? And so whilst we've done a lot of work in the area of access, it is now time to look beyond access and ask ourselves, once they get in there, what infrastructure we put in place? How do we change our curriculum? How do we ensure that truly no one is being left behind, not just by their physical participation, but in terms of how much skills they are getting to equip them to engage in the economic system. So it is very important. And one thing also that I want to point and learning, right? How have we looked at teaching and learning? It's continuing with what the colonial, system left behind, which most of the time is this rote learning where you chew and pour, where where you give back the teacher what they've given to you. And so in the absence of teacher, you are left, on your own. I feel that it's time that we reimagine what teaching and learning is. To what extent do we empower us to take ownership of their learning? And to what extent do we put systems with them to take ownership of their learning, right? And whilst we give them this responsibility, what infrastructure do we need to put in place to ensure that everyone who is given access actually is to graduate and graduate with a quality education, okay? One thing that also came to the forefront is, we're looking at holistically supporting our students. And so I'll give an example of Ashesi, for instance. The student experience is beyond the classroom, is beyond the education, the technical skills you give them. When the student steps out of that classroom and it's not in a sound mental space, it's not healthy, it's not, positions in ways, if they are finishing school, how am I going to get a job? That's about across board, whether the primary, the secondary, or university level. So for us, for instance, we had to move not just our academic system online, but we had to move the entire student services also online. So any student who needs counseling will still get counseling despite the fact that they are home. We are doing several town hall meetings across everybody to understand what are the issues, because we noticed that once they went home, their dynamic changed, right? If you are in school, it's different. You have to navigate, helping family, dealing with some of these issues that Cynthia pointed about is different. So at a point, as a university, for instance, we had to send emails to all parents to remind them that their kids are still in school, because parents sort of thought that these students spending a lot of time behind the computer, they are playing video games, or they are just having fun. And that's why when your younger sibling needs, when I need someone to run errands, you are just behind your computer line, right? So we had to send out emails to all parents to tell them school is still in session, and have deliverables to end the semester. Right, so this collaboration beyond the classroom is needed. Collaboration with the students to understand their needs, put the support service, online for them to also access it, and also work alongside their parents to see how best they can support the process. And then finally, I think my last point before I close is just improving the standard of education across board. So, this whole some students or some schools having resources and others not having is one thing that we really need to pay attention to. That in Ghana, what is happening is about just 14 in high schools in the entire country are the ones feeding our universities with students, right? Because they are the ones that are resourced. They are the ones that have attracting the best students from across the country. And we say that that common in many African countries, and that is not okay. A child should be able next to the school across the street and be sure that the quality is the same. That rural kid in their home village who would not have access to an urban education should have the same standard regardless where they are. I conclude with this quote that I find very, very relevant to the times that we are in, which says that hope is essential to action and can be a driving force for change. Right? Sometimes hoping can be overwhelming because for a minute or two, you dare yourself to imagine a different way of life and what the future could look like. Above all, hope to me is the countless people and voices, often on the periphery of society, who are leading with their selfless knowledge and compassion. And I believe that this is where we all come on board. Some of us are working at the heart of the pandemic to ensure that when it comes to the various areas that technical abilities we are in and supporting, and I'll say that's the right thing to do. I have personally been overwhelmed with the level of support that we've had, and I was sharing with the panel before coming on to this platform that we had students, for instance, who couldn't go home, but within hours of sending out email to our community to say that we have all these students who can't go home because of one thing or the other. We've had families who have taken them in, who these kids have, a place to stay, not have to worry about that. I will say that this is a call for all of us to chime in and do the best we can to ensure that this change that this pandemic could potentially present of us actually does happen, and we do not go back to business as usual when things begin to normalize. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to receiving your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Millicent. I'm glad you joined again and could finish your presentation. It was great to hear also the reflection on the sustainable development goals, particularly SDG 4, which is about quality education. And I think, again, there's many questions that to all the panelists, so thank you again to all the panelists, that out of which we will address no more than 5 in the interest of time. We're quite advanced already. So I'm moving back the lever over to my dear colleague Sonali to share a few of the questions that have emerged throughout the presentation in the chat window.
Thank you, Lars. And I think some of the questions are already being answered in the chat by our panelists. So please do have a look at that as well. One question to just wrap up the initial question we had asked when Millicent rejoined is how would we possibly level the playing field once students come back to their regular classes, in terms of those who've had access to internet and were able to continue their studies and those who haven't? Or for example, some students, some universities maybe, or schools took upon an approach that would say, okay, you either pass the grade or you fail, and some were still giving marks. So how would this affect their future? Just these different variabilities in that have taken place during this time.
I'll go. In my schools, we kind of did a pass-fail situation. And I know some school districts were also doing just a combination of your grades from the first 3 quarters. And they also made possibilities for students who maybe didn't have the best grades. If they were really participating, they had the opportunity to bring your grade up. There was a really big focus on not punishing students for the school closures due to COVID-19. So we really wanted students to be able to pass on to the next grade. We haven't really discussed, and those are the questions that are going to be coming this summer and discussions that are going to be coming this summer. How are we going to assess where all of our different students are and provide teaching or provide intervention for those students who may be behind? Some ideas right now might be possibly doing like extra classes or providing like extra opportunities. But once again, kind of how we've been talking about throughout is, if they already didn't have access, how are we going to provide more access and then more opportunities? So hopefully we'll have more information in the coming days. I know my school district has a meeting planned beginning in June.
I can add that at our university level, how do we ensure that those who were not able to participate, regardless of all the interventions, are not disadvantaged when things get back to normal? And the way we are approaching it is that we are going to give them we call it an incomplete, and either they may have to do find a way during the summer, if we were to come back in the fall, to complete it. But there's been several interventions. In my daughter's school, for instance, they are using their continuous assessment, to because it couldn't write the end of year that the pandemic is in. So during their continuous assistance, helping students who were not able to do well during the continuous assessment to find ways of coming to speed with that. But it's a major issue that many universities and many high schools.
Thank you, Millicent. Yeah, it's completely understandable that everybody is still looking for ways to improve and bring things back to normal. But we think there would be a better success rate with students who are in high school and universities, but how would we ensure social distancing, for example, in students who are below the age of 8, like kindergartens and up to the age of 8, and also the mental aspect of it in younger students who've never had to really do online studies but are now forced to, and really put a gap between the friendships and the bonding that they're able to have at schools.
I mean, it's quite interesting, the presentation from Germany, because I looked at it with a lot of fascination, and I imagine our school system with one class. My class at the university level is 60 students, right? How am I going to do social distancing with 60 students? And already with the 60 students, I meet them twice a week. So am I going to meet them 4, 5, 6 times? And this is worse when you go down to the secondary and primary level. You can have a class size that is as big as 70, right? And at the University of Ghana, the public universities, you can have about 300, 400 students in one class. How do you do social distancing? It's just mind-boggling. And so as governments are struggling to even open, these are some of the things that are coming up. How are we going to do social distancing? How are we going to make sure that reopening the schools, it's not going to erase all the gains we've made with our level of infection, So that's a big problem comes to the continent, unlike other well-developed countries.
Yes, Carlos.
So Nali, I just want to stress the fact that I answered some of this in the chat, but Arun asked about how to plan a timeline, and what we have seen is that the most valuable skill we can have now is a very good ability for diverse forecasting, because right now we don't know if this is going to be something over in August, probably not. If this is going to be like different waves. So what we have seen as a very interesting idea for forecasting is some universities have planned for 4 scenarios. One, if this is a global doom event, and that's the worst one. If we have repeated waves, if we have something that has already happened and it's starting to fade out, and the other one I don't remember. But the point is that the forecasting and the ability for all of us to plan for these different scenarios is going to be, I think, the key fact that's going to tackle if we can tackle this issue or not. Because right now, I think most of us in our different jobs or areas of work are trying to survive this moment. But we have to start planning ahead for these different scenarios, start imagining what the world's going to be like in these different cases. So I think that's one point I want to stress out. And I think it's really interesting to have these conversations about what's happening in other parts of the world to understand and to get some insights for our personal and local forecasting. The other thing I wanted to stress out is that in the case of the university, we have 6 principles about how to guide this process. And the first one, answering a question from Trifin, I think, is that no matter what, we have to continue teaching. Our teaching, especially in public schools and in public universities, is public good. I mean, we make public good when we continue teaching. So it's very important that we develop the tools and we develop the skill sets to continue teaching, to maintain the bond between the students and the school or the university or the college. If we lose that, it's really hard to get it back. I mean, and even though the emergency remote teaching is not the best scenario we could have, even though we're having countless problems with practices and practical activities, we have to find the ways to continue teaching, because otherwise we're going to lose contact with our students and we're going to be frozen, and restart from there is going to be really, really hard. So I wanted to stress this out because we have seen in some academic communities, we have seen some resistance to emergency remote teaching. Some of our academics have said, okay, it's not possible, man. I mean, we have to stop it and we have to retake it when this is over. But we don't know when this is over. And the most important fact is we don't know how this is going to be over. If it's going to be because there is a vaccine that's going to save us in 6 months, or if we're going to have to learn to live like the presentation we had from Germany with social distancing. So it's really important, that part, that we don't freeze, that we don't stop doing what we do, because education in every aspect, from from every institution is public good. And if we stop doing this, I mean, it's really hard to restart.
Yep, definitely. And I think this would be the final question we have, is especially in, for example, taking the Indian scenario. A lot of Indian students who have finished their bachelor's generally, or a lot of them would go to Europe or USA for master programs, and it costs a lot of money. And this year, a lot of people have already paid, but then because of the virus, obviously, and the lockdowns, they're forced to be at home. So there is the two-pronged question there is, are universities doing anything to reduce the cost of their program fees? And will online platforms like, for example, Coursera or edX help the education system, where students who had initially planned to do masters in other places but now have to be home, use these platforms to actually get a degree? And do you think it would carry the same weight as another degree from a proper university?
Let me attempt to respond to that. Now, in our own scenario, there's been a lot of collaboration between government and a lot of the telecommunication system, and I'm seeing that a lot across the continent also, where they zero rate the educational site, right? And so regardless of whether you are in Ghana or Namibia or Kenya, provided you're accessing an educational site, whether it's in the US or Chile or Europe, okay, so in terms of cost, there's a whole lot of conversation going on about, working and expanding this to places where there isn't access to that infrastructure. On our side, for instance, one thing we did, and in response to the comments that Carlos passed, that it's very important that they do not pause, because even when they are going into employment, many employees are not recruiting now, right? Many of these employees are going online now. And so the problem is not just continuing education, but also I'm not gonna find a job because they are not recruiting, just because of the times that we are in, and what is the implication. And I know that a lot of conversation now is going into, whilst you cannot get a job, find a way of adding more skills. So our career services, for instance, is doing a lot with our students on, if you were planning to go to grad school and that it's not happening, what else can you do? And that also takes a lot of conversation, because this is uncharted territory for many of these young people trying to navigate, right? What else do you do if you're not able to go? Because, for us, our major headache for our international community in terms of students is that we can decide to lift our borders, right? But their countries will still be restricting movement. Their countries' borders will still be closed. How do we still give access to our international students? Are we heading to a point where, international students, regardless of whether they are going to Europe or Africa or wherever, are restricted by one form of restriction or the other, by, if it's not that second country, by their own country? And what do we do? Are we going to recruit international students? Are we not going to recruit international students? So it's really dicey, and much as it's tough that the online doesn't give equal access, it's beginning to look like, until we find a better solution, that is the only option. So personally, as director of the international programs, I've had a lot of conversations from our US partners who have approached me to say, so for Lehigh, for instance, we're working in partnership with them for their students to start the first year at Ashesi. And then depending on how things, go in the second spring semester, if things normalize. Graduate programs who have given admissions to their international students are coming up with some of these innovative ways where they identify a local partner in the person's home country where they can start the semester, and then whilst things normalize, they then move to, you know, those host institutions. So those are some of the ways that we are beginning to see possibilities in terms of engaging with international students.
Sonali?
Yeah.
Regarding the edX or Coursera question, I think that many universities are gonna use this time of this very short learning curve, probably to develop programs that previously they thought that were not possible online. And probably they're gonna export some of those learnings that we have had in this process to promote more online learning. I think that one of the problems there is that, as in the presentation, what we have been doing is not online education. So the temptation for some institutions to just like do this, like online education, could be challenging for quality of the teaching. And I think that's something that institutions should take very careful. I mean, they should be very, very cautious about transiting from the previous situation to online education just for this experience, because online education has other coordinates. And complementing what Millicent said about what happens with the international relations in terms of education, I think what's happening now is going to reshape international relations everywhere. I mean, we were just discussing in the office 2 weeks ago that we used to travel to visit partners all over the world. And this has showed us that many of those travels in terms of the professional product could be money that we save and we do it like we're doing it right now. But it's important, and it's something I think we should stress also, that some of those travels also involve bonding, involve other terms of activities. And I think also in these terms, we shouldn't just give in on traveling or in meeting face to face. I mean, that's a very important part of the human relationship. And these formats could help us to solve this situation. Probably we can optimize some of the use of the resources in other areas, but the human relation face to face cannot be replaced. And I think that's an important part of the discussion going forward too. I mean, we cannot start living in an online world just because we could solve this momentaneous crisis. And I think no one is really talking about that currently, and probably some companies and some universities are gonna have a very interesting struggle when international travels open again, about how to prioritize who travels and for what. And I think it's an important question for the Milton Foundation too. I mean, how to engage in this once the borders are open and we can leave our world again.
And thank you, Carlos, for pointing this pretty much to the core of things. And I would say, kind of looking at kind of in terms of conclusion. So Millicent talked about earlier. You talked about education on pause, and we talked a lot about teaching. And I think also with the conversation around online emergency online teaching versus online learning. To me, at least, it has become quite clear that there's a significant difference between teacher-dependent kind of transmission of knowledge and holistic approach to personal capacity development, skills, values, attitudes, etc. Which, of course, we're also teachers and educators. More than teachers, educators are the key. So I really wanted to thank all of you for bringing your points and experiences and challenges to this forum. And particularly thank you for Millicent also for pointing out the opportunities that come with it. And I guess this is really the building the bridge about talking about opportunity to introduce our executive director, Stefan, bridge opportunity, joke aside, to leave us with a few final words as we're concluding this town hall session. And again, before moving over to Stefan, thank you all to the panelists for listening in.
Yeah, the same thanks go especially also to Lars and Sonali, who put together that very interesting, engaging panel. This was the third panel in our series or town hall of our series of Quarantine with Me. So when the COVID struck and we realized that this is going to be, of course, something that we'll be dealing with over the long term, at the executive office, we also thought, okay, what can we do to serve our fellows, our stakeholders, our TTs, CCs, and so like, to be part of the discussion. And the first step really was opening up our NFO, where the junior fellows explained or presented like how the virus has hit their own countries. And at that moment, it was really that China was still at the forefront. They already had the lockdown. It was the first week of Germany locking down. So really at the beginning, so some of the people were telling us, you know, how they managed to come home to be with their parents. It was really at the getting into the first kind of phase of isolation. And by now we're really on down the road where we see very different developments around the world again. That, for example, if Germany seems to be doing well, they are opening up again. There's a lot of progress in terms of freeing some of the liberties, but on the other hand, there are still many, many things to cope with. Especially like Carlos said, we at the executive office, we also think, okay, what are the consequences for the Melton Foundation? Travel is a big part of our programs, and the face-to-face meetings are very integral to making these bonds of friendships, getting into the intercultural understanding. We always say this is where the magic happens. It might be that we do a lot of good educational programs, workshops, and so forth, but nothing beats the late rooms in the hotel room, where late hours, where you really get down to the core issues, where the trust is built, where you can ask all kinds of questions that you might not be able to do in a more formal environment. But having said that, we also work with different scenarios how to continue. We hope that we can be able to meet in November in Chile, but at the moment doesn't look so well, so to be quite honest. So we also look for different scenarios how to cope with that. But anyways, we hope that with this series that we set up, we enabled some of the interaction in between the countries. We started with the health workers in Chile, USA, and Germany, which was also a very interesting town hall. Then we moved to economy and society to look at what's the economic implication, but more than that, also what does it mean for people, for workers, for systems, for economic systems, where we also had Bill Melton as our guests on Melton Day, and now this third one looking for the educational side. For this, we conclude kind of the series of the town hall meetings. At the same time, we'll have next week a very interesting ideathon that is kind of a mix of people coming together for 2 days intensively trying to work on solutions, to also think like, what can we do? What are the challenges that we can overcome and make opportunities out of it? We continue, if you haven't seen that yet, I just can tell you it's really also enlightening to look in the social medias. There's these well-being challenges where our fellows kind of post short videos about what can you do to feel better in this crisis. There are really, really nice recordings, simple things, going out to the sun, or so somebody's actually learning Japanese folk songs. So there's all kind of things you can think of. So just to conclude, I wish you all the best and stay, for example, not only safe, but please try to stay sane as well. I feel like there's a lot of psychological challenges for all of us being homes for so long time. It's not easy, so reach out to your friends as much as you can. Please consider this as your family. We're there for you as well, and all the best, and thanks again for participating in our activities.
Well, thank you very much for the closing words, Stefan. Much appreciated. I just wanted to point out that in the chat, some of the panelists have shared contact details. So if you would want to follow up the conversation, there's never enough conversation to be had, and there's never enough time in town halls, and we're already way beyond time because there's so much to talk about. Make sure to keep the conversation going, keep in touch. The implications, there's always quoting Bill Melton, the founder of the Mel Foundation, also from the last time, never waste a good crisis. This is the opportunity to reimagine how we do things, how we interact, engage, how we prioritize, etc. And talking about how we talk and engage, I guess the moment has come for all of us to unmute, or all of us who want to unmute and just shout out a quick and heartfelt goodbye, farewell, take care, whatever you want, and feel free to join on camera for this moment. It's magical. Thank you so much, everybody, and take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Ciao, Javier Mora.